An elderly man named Henry is hiking along an ice-covered seashore when he sees a polar bear attacking a man. He tries to shoot the bear, but accidentally kills the man instead. A sheriff named Dan arrives at the scene and tells Henry to go home, saying he will take care of it. 3 months later, 2 children discover a frozen mammoth. One of them, Liam, takes one of its teeth and brings it home. As soon as he enters the house, he collapses in front of his mother, Jules. When Liam's father, Frank, returns, he finds Liam burning with a high fever. Later, a doctor named Margaret visits Liam and explains that he has mumps caused by a viral infection. She tells the family that someone must watch him at all times until he recovers. Meanwhile, 2 local men, Ronnie and Jason, find the mammoth and decide to sell it to a research center and split the profit. Next, Ronnie and Jason transport the mammoth to a warehouse. Jason takes its teeth and shows them to a professor named Charlie. However, Charlie refuses to buy the teeth, saying he wants to claim them for science. This angers Jason, who takes the teeth and runs off. Later, Dan visits Henry, who is still haunted by the memory of killing the man 3 months ago. Henry reveals that no bullets were found in the body of the man he shot, a geologist named Billy. He accuses Dan of hiding the bullet. Henry also confronts Dan about being at the scene earlier, but Dan admits that Billy was going to die from the bear attack anyway, hinting he knows more about Billy's death. Later that night, Jules leaves Liam in Frank's care and goes out. After she leaves, a local waitress named Elena visits Frank, and they have an affair in the shed. While they are together, Liam wakes up, goes outside barefoot, and walks into the snow half naked. Next, Frank returns to the house with blood on his shirt, quickly cleans up, and changes his clothes. Jules also comes home and finds Liam awake in his bed. Suddenly, Liam starts screaming in pain, saying his feet hurt. When his parents check, they see his feet have turned blue from the cold. They rush him to the hospital where the doctor tells them Liam might need an amputation. Jules realizes Frank left Liam alone and blames him for their son's injuries. She demands to know where Frank was, but he leaves without answering. That same night, a scientist named Vincent, who recently arrived in town, visits Charlie at his home. He is shocked to find Charlie lying on the ground with his insides gutted. Vincent checks his pulse, but before he can act, Dan, who is already in the house, arrests him and takes him to the station. Meanwhile, Margaret tells Jules that the research center in town might be able to help Liam without needing to amputate his feet, but Jules must consent despite the risks involved. Just then, Margaret hears about the incident at Charlie's house and rushes to the scene. Dan examines the wounds and deduces this is not a bear attack. However, Margaret makes a shocking discovery: Charlie is still alive. They rush him to the hospital and attempt to save his life. Next, Henry learns about Charlie's condition and calls the police, accusing Dan of being responsible for both Charlie's attack and Billy's death 3 months ago. He claims Dan acted under the orders of Governor Hilder. Later, Hilder informs Dan that Charlie died on the operating table. Dan then interrogates Vincent, who insists Charlie was already dead when he found him. Meanwhile, Liam is transferred to the research center for treatment. The police soon realize that Charlie's assistant, Natalie, is missing. She could either be the culprit or another victim of the same attack, so they begin searching for her. Next, an inspector named Eugene arrives in town from London to investigate the case. However, Hilder and Dan decide to keep Vincent in custody, even though they know he is innocent, until they find the real culprit. Later, Frank confesses to Jules that he was with another woman the day Liam got frostbite. Angry and hurt, Jules tells him to leave the house, so Frank moves into Elena's hotel. Next, Eugene meets with Dan, but Dan isn't very cooperative. Eugene later visits the morgue, but Dan's hostility forces him to leave. Meanwhile, Hilder's husband, Eric, who is the chief of police, remembers seeing Jason arguing with Charlie a few days before Charlie's death. He advises Dan to look for Jason. When Dan questions Jason's wife, she reveals that Jason is helping Natalie, who is reported missing. In the morning, Dan takes Frank and goes to Natalie's known location. There, they find Jason and Natalie, who were having an affair. During interrogation, Jason claims he was with his brother, Ciaran, at his shop when Charlie was attacked. He explains that the argument with Charlie was brief and only about Charlie's refusal to buy the mammoth tooth. Dan then gives the tooth to Natalie to examine if it is real. Next, Vincent is released from custody. Later, Dan is informed that Ciaran is nowhere to be found. The next morning, Henry begins acting violently, overwhelmed by guilt over killing Billy. Dan visits Henry and confesses that he was the one who killed Billy. After this, Dan and the police break into Ciaran's place, only to find him tied up and beaten. Ciaran tells them Ronnie is responsible. Ronnie attacked him, stole his boat from the shop, and fled town. The whole town begins searching for Ronnie's daughter, Carrie, while Frank and Dan search for Ronnie himself. Later, Eric finds a shirt with blood on it at Frank's place and takes it to the station. Meanwhile, two mysterious men named Yuri and Max discuss Eugene, who is investigating what happened to Charlie and Billy. They reveal that Eugene has found a map Billy claimed would lead to a fortune, but Eugene doesn't realize its importance. While Eugene continues his investigation, believing Henry is at the center of everything, Yuri sneaks into Eugene's hotel room and steals photographs of the map. Meanwhile, Natalie urges Jason to reveal the location of the Mammoth, arguing it should be used for scientific research since it is over 32,000 years old. However, Jason insists the tooth is a family heirloom and claims there is no mammoth. Elsewhere, Ronnie visits the warehouse and cuts off the mammoth's tusk to sell it. He takes the tusk to his hideout and tells Carrie that something bad happened back home, but denies any involvement. Next, Dan returns to the station and learns the blood on Frank's shirt belongs to Charlie. Dan confronts Frank at Elena's hotel room, finding him in the shower. Consumed by jealousy over Frank's relationship with Elena, Dan beats him up and takes him into custody. That night, Margaret's daughter, Shirley, visits the warehouse but leaves after noticing the smell of the carcass. She then visits Elena, who is shocked to learn of Frank's arrest. Later, Hilda and Eugene interrogate Frank. Frank claims the blood on his shirt came from Liam, whose swollen throat had burst. Jules refuses to confirm this, instead accusing Frank of leaving Liam alone, which led to his frostbite. Frank then admits he stepped out that day to have an affair with Elena and returned to find Liam covered in blood. After digging into Elena's past, Eugene discovers she moved to town after being charged with murder. When confronted, Elena admits her past but denies involvement in Charlie's death. However, when Eugene mentions Billy's murder, Elena's expression changes, leading Eugene to suspect she may be connected to it. Later, Dan searches Liam's bedroom and finds blood-stained pajamas, confirming that Frank was telling the truth. A flashback reveals that on the day Liam walked out, he killed the professor while Frank and Elena were having an affair. However, Liam appeared to be possessed during the attack. Back in the present, Eugene discovers Liam's fingernails embedded in Charlie's ribs, further proving Frank's innocence. When they briefly wake Liam, he admits to attacking a man that night. But before he can say more, his frostbite becomes unbearable, and he must be sedated again. Next, Frank is released, but now his son is the talk of the town, accused of murder. Meanwhile, Shirley becomes ill after visiting the warehouse. Eugene continues his investigation and speaks with Max after reviewing Billy's files. Max reveals that Yuri was the one who stole the photographs from Eugene. That night, Eugene returns to his room, the same one Billy had stayed in. He notices that part of the carpet and flooring has been recently replaced. Suspicious, he questions Elena, asking if bloodstains forced the changes. Elena recalls a flashback of Christmas night when Yuri and Billy were drinking together. Billy showed Yuri the photograph, calling it a treasure. Eric then arrived and told Yuri to leave. As Yuri left, he saw Eric and Billy fighting. Before Yuri could intervene, he fell and was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, both men were gone, but the photograph was still there. Elena doesn't share this memory with Eugene and simply walks away. However, the next morning, she speaks with Dan, who assures her that Eugene doesn't have any evidence. This reveals that both Elena and Dan know what truly happened to Billy. Next, Henry develops photographs he took 3 months earlier and spots a hand tied to a cell tower, possibly belonging to Billy. Meanwhile, Eugene questions Yuri, who accuses Eric of killing Billy. Yuri explains what happened that Christmas night and gives Eugene a bullet he found near Billy's death site. Yuri believes Eric killed Billy for the treasure hidden beneath the ice shown in the photograph and suspects the police are covering it up. Later that night, Shirley enters a trance-like state and attacks her mother, Margaret, stabbing her multiple times. She slices open Margaret's abdomen and pours a clear liquid into it from her mouth before walking away barefoot, just like Liam did. In the morning, Margaret is found barely alive and rushed to the hospital. Next, Eugene sneaks into a room where police weapons are stored and tries to match the bullet with the officers' rifles, but finds no match. Next, Ronnie, who is on the run with Carrie, has his tusks stolen. When he tries to return to town, he collapses unconscious. Later, Shirley is found dead in a store, and Carrie stumbles into the same store looking for help for her father. Elena takes Carrie in and begins caring for her until Ronnie returns. Meanwhile, Eugene and Dan work together to solve Margaret's attack. They discover bloodstains on Shirley's hands, confirming that she was the one who attacked Margaret. Meanwhile, Ronnie regains consciousness and returns to his home. There, he finds a video playing on a projector, but before he can react, a man strikes him on the head from behind. Next, Vincent receives a letter from Charlie, sent on the day of his death. The letter authorizes Vincent to study a polar bear that was killed after it attacked and ate another polar bear. Vincent and Natalie dissect the bear's brain and discover toxins that caused its violent behavior. They later examine Shirley's brain and find the same toxins. Later, Henry decides to leave town and end his life in the wilderness. Before he leaves, he bids farewell to Dan, who tells him that everything he did was out of love, not selfishness. The two men share a hug, and Henry leaves. Soon after, Eugene finds the film Henry was developing and sees the image of Billy's hand tied to the cell tower. Eugene then heads into the wilderness to find Henry. Meanwhile, his colleagues in London analyze Billy's photograph, which reveals hundreds of frozen mammoths beneath the ice. At the same time, Vincent and Natalie conduct tests to see if Liam has the same toxins in his brain. To their surprise, the results show no toxins, meaning Liam's actions were fully conscious. Natalie and Vincent conclude that despite this, there may still be a dangerous pathogen in the town and recommend placing the entire area under quarantine. Next, Jason starts showing symptoms similar to Shirley's and leaves his home without his wife noticing. Meanwhile, Eugene finds Henry in the wilderness and tells him that he now knows who shot Billy, but he wants to understand why. Shockingly, Henry shoots Eugene, but immediately regrets it and tries to help him. Meanwhile, Natalie tries to leave town with Liam, but discovers that the airport is closed. Furious, she learns that no one is allowed to leave. Back in the wilderness, Henry confesses to Eugene that Dan is his son, but that he never told him. Henry then radios Dan, revealing that he shot Eugene because Eugene knows everything. After this, Henry pulls out his gun and shoots himself. Later, Dan arrives in a helicopter and finds Henry dead. He tries to take Eugene to safety, but Eugene, barely conscious, demands to know why Billy was killed. Dan finally reveals the truth about that Christmas night. After Eric and Billy fought, Billy asked Elena to bring him ice to his room. When she brought the ice, Billy handcuffed her to the bed and tried to rape her. Elena managed to grab a knife and stab Billy in the back before calling Dan. When Dan arrived, Billy had already raped Elena and was sitting in the corner of the bed. Enraged, Dan dragged Billy to a remote cell tower and handcuffed him there. By morning, a bear attacked Billy, but Henry found him and accidentally killed him while trying to stop the bear. After hearing the story, Eugene urges Dan to confess but succumbs to his injuries and dies from blood loss. Next, Dan reports his findings to Hildur, who informs him that more investigators from London will soon arrive. Meanwhile, Yuri and Max steal an ice drill and head to the location marked on Billy's map. At the same time, Jason attacks Natalie but stops and flees, claiming something is inside him. Natalie reports the incident to the police, who begin searching for Jason. Soon after, the missing drill is reported, and Jason becomes the prime suspect. Yuri and Max proceed with their digging. Meanwhile, Vincent visits Margaret, who is still in a coma. He discovers that her body is covered in multiple small swellings, each containing prehistoric parasitic flying insects resembling tiny wasps. Suddenly, thousands of the creatures swarm out of Margaret's mouth and eyes, filling the room. Natalie arrives and sees the swarm through the window. Vincent urges her to keep the door shut and call Dan, as he remains trapped inside with the insects. Dan arrives and assesses the situation. He tells them the wasps must be destroyed at all costs. Vincent suggests using gas to eliminate the swarm before they escape into the town. Later, the team fills the room with gas, and Vincent ignites it, causing a massive explosion. Remarkably, Vincent survives, though he is severely burned. Afterward, Natalie informs Hildur that the insects likely came from the prehistoric mammoth and needed a host to fully develop into adult insects. Meanwhile, Elena begins showing the same symptoms as Jason and Shirley. Later, Eric finds Yuri and Max at their dig site, where the excavation is complete. As Yuri and Eric point their guns at each other, Max runs away. The two men fight, and Yuri knocks Eric unconscious before descending into the hole. However, the rope breaks, and Yuri falls into the depths. Next, a radio message informs Eric that Jason has been found. When questioned, Jason reveals the location of the mammoth he and Ronnie discovered. He also confesses that he killed Ronnie. The police locate the warehouse where the mammoth is stored and burn it. Jason later succumbs to his symptoms, but not before revealing that Ronnie's body was hidden in Ronnie's house all along. Meanwhile, Carrie finds Elena gravely ill. In her confused and violent state, Elena attacks Carrie, unaware of what she's doing. As she tries to stab Carrie with a knife, Dan arrives just in time and shoots Elena to stop her from harming the girl. He immediately calls for an ambulance to take Elena to the hospital. Next, Yuri wakes up at the bottom of the hole, only to discover he is surrounded by hundreds of mammoth carcasses and fully grown wasps. The season ends with Vincent waking up from his coma, while Elena lies unconscious in her hospital bed. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like our channel and subscribe if you enjoy content like this. Also, if you'd like to see us recap Season 2, let us know in the comments.